Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Go to shiftingculturepodcast.com to interact and donate. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app to be notified when new episodes come out each Tuesday. And go, leave a rating and review. It's easy, it only takes a moment, and it helps us find new listeners to the show. So just go to the show page on the app that you're using right now and hit 5 stars. It really is that easy. Thank you so much. Previous guests on the show have included Michael Frost, Pete Gregg, and Lucy Pepiot. You could go back, listen to those episodes and more. But today's guest is Andrew Root. I am thrilled that Andy returns to the podcast in this episode. Andrew Root is the Carrie Olson Balson Professor of Youth and Family Ministry at Luther Seminary. He writes and researches in areas of theology, ministry, culture, and younger generations. He's written many books, included Churches in the Crisis of Decline, Faith Formation in a Secular Age, and Exploding Stars, Dead Dinosaurs, and Zombies, Youth Ministry in the Age of Science. In this episode, we talk about his latest book, When Church Stops Working, and we get into why innovation isn't the answer. We head in the direction of waiting for the Spirit's leading, paying attention to our stories, being witnesses to the acts of God, and sitting with the sorrows of our neighbors. It's a great conversation that gets cut off just a little short due to a Wi-Fi outage in Andy's area, but that also seemed fitting as we talk about the idea that innovation promises to smooth over our crises, but the idea of being a Christian in this world is that we have to embrace crisis. There isn't a way out of it. So, I know you're going to love this one. Enjoy my conversation with Andrew Root. Andy, welcome back to the podcast. I'm really excited to have you back on, so thanks for joining me.
Yeah, it's great to be back.
Yeah, I just finished this book, When Church Stops Working, and it's really beneficial and helpful. And I'm just going to start here with what you say in chapter 1. And I'm going to read it just because it really struck me. And I'm not one to write in books, but I highlighted this and I put a star. Yet I had my son. I was like, you got to go get me a pen, go into the desk. I got to highlight this. It's because
so you don't read with a pen and like highlight.
Not in the book.
Wow.
I like to keep the book clean. I will write notes on a separate piece of paper.
But not in the book.
I don't know. I like my books clean.
No, it's fascinating people's different style.
I know.
Reading books. Like some people, little lines, some people crazy writing in it. So yeah.
Yeah. Lots of notes on paper. But it says, you said effective innovation has not stopped the crisis in the church because the crisis comes from the very place that effective innovation comes from, the secular age. Instead of helping the church, effective innovation actually worsens the crisis by driving us deeper into the secular age we find ourselves in. And it seems to be like this is your thesis. All right, innovation isn't working. We've been trying for years to come up with new innovation to stop this crisis of the church not working. So because innovation isn't working and it's stressing us out and giving us more anxiety and making the problem worse, what's the solution?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question, and it's a really necessary question. The solution, I think, first and foremost, and this may be, give your listeners a little a whiplash or something, or concuss them in some ways. The first solution is not to try to avoid the crisis, like to realize that to be a faithful Christian, to do ministry in this cultural moment is to have to embrace crisis. And so there's no way out of the crisis, which I think is sometimes one of the deep temptations of this kind of innovation, is that if we can just get it right, if we can just find our genius, then we can get ourselves beyond the land of crisis. And I don't know, I tend to think if you're a Protestant, particularly, just the way the Protestant imagination works, you can't really believe that. You're always in some sense in crisis. I just think we've in America gotten the crisis wrong in the context of the church. And the crisis is not somehow we have to save ourselves from decline. Somehow we have to get more with less. But the crisis is that this God speaks and acts, that this God still moves in history. And yet we're all formed, Christian or not, to have a hard time perceiving that. Like it takes certain work. And I don't kind of mean that as a kind of effort kind of work as much as it takes a way of seeing. It takes a vision, which maybe sometimes is painful. But that becomes the hard part. I guess what I've said before to folks is, I think what often keeps, say, pastors up or ministry leaders up at night usually are things like, how are we going to get more of the less? And like, you can't fall back asleep, because you're thinking like, if our roof starts leaking, we're screwed. Like, we can't make ends meet, or we just our budget was 20% bigger 8 years ago when I started at this church. And so there's a lot of sleepless nights that way, but I think rarely are there sleepless nights with people staring at the ceiling thinking like, how am I going to help these folks be able to discern the act of God in their lives? Like, how am I going to preach to these people so that they might really wrestle with the act and being of God? I don't think a lot of, I live with a pastor here, so, I don't think a lot of pastors spend nights up staring at the ceiling and with that anxiety. And what I'm ultimately really afraid of is that we start misdiagnosing our kind of sense of the crisis, and we start thinking like, I just got to find a way to do more with less. I have to find a way to become more creative and more of a genius, and I have to figure this out, or I have to really blame myself for this not working. So I think the solution is to get right on the crisis and to become much more interested people in the act and being of God in the world, and to recognize that isn't easy. Like it'd be kind of pietistic sugar pill to just be like, well, just focus on God. That's easy. I think that's actually quite difficult, and difficult because of the way our culture kind of forms us, and difficult because God is God, and God cannot be made into a brand or into a simple idea. And the work of the God that was testified to in the biblical text often confronts us and explodes our categories, and comes to us in dynamic ways that are not always very comfortable. And so that is a difficulty, I think.
And the things that you were mentioning, I think, come as a distraction of helping us think that the crisis isn't here of trying to help people discern where God is acting and where He is and how we can encounter God. The crisis is in the roof that is leaking.
Yeah.
That brings me to a question of, so do we need new wineskins? Do we need a place where, hey, maybe these large buildings or maybe something, it's distracting us from how we're interacting as a congregation and a community of God? I know you didn't really touch on that, but that's one of that just struck me. Maybe that the building itself can be a distraction.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think there's a lot of creative people who are looking at that, and even looking at it from like economic models and things like that, and want to be really careful, because one of the issues with property is, once you sell it or get rid of it, you're never getting it back. And it usually is a one kind of payment thing. You know what I mean? So, and I think there's a deep temptation, and actually, this is maybe overstated, but not much. I think there's a lot of pastors and denominations know of like real estate companies and things that have taken a lot of advantage of pastors getting their properties, knowing that it may not be the best thing. So there's a lot of wisdom that needs to be kind of thought through on how we think about that. But there is a real way that I think you're right, that the buildings we end up serving the buildings more than the mission or the people within it, and that's an issue. But at the other side of this, and this is probably what's so frustrating for people to read me, it's more complicated than that too, because we are human bodies, and human bodies need spaces to be in. And historically, the church is out. It's a gathered community, and that has to happen somewhere. Does it have to happen in the same kind of buildings we have now? No, and there's been times it hasn't before, but it still really matters where we gather and how we gather. And I think one of the realities of our secular age that makes makes us be able to spin things closed and have a hard time thinking about God is, and this is a real Protestant issue too, is that, ritual and symbol is hard for us. And buildings tend to be ritualized and have symbol around them. And, that's part of, I guess, the Protestant imagination that's hurt us, is we've stripped a lot of that ritual and symbol out for other good theological reasons, but we at times have allowed those to become secularized in their own way. But so we should think about our buildings and how our buildings become kind of an albatross around our neck. But at the same time, we should be very careful that there is also something about stewarding what we've received from earlier generations.
Yeah.
And that human bodies will need spaces to be together, and that symbol and ritual will be very important in that we cannot be disconnected from space. So it's a really a complicated moment, but you could see how this innovation thing could kind of form you in a negative way. I'm kind of thinking Silicon Valley based innovation, because part of it is like when you're a startup company, like you roll the dice and you want to go to 1 million or you want to go to 0. You know what I mean? Like you're throwing the dice and going for it. So you could see a congregation that says, like, let's sell our building and let's see what happens. Let's use the resources and let's go here. Let's roll the dice. And if it comes up, this is where my gambling knowledge comes to an end. I don't know when it comes up to sixes, whenever it might come up. I don't even know what game we're playing now, but there's a kind of sense of like, let's cash in our building and let's go for it. And that is a certain kind of mentality in itself too, and I am concerned about that kind of mentality, which is like all out, make or break, as opposed to the kind of patient disposition, kind of recognizing the long tail of this thing, like that you are stewarding a collective, an institution, a confession of faith that is 2,000 years old, and is so, it's okay to also just, keep walking in the same direction faithfully. And there may be times where the Spirit really says, sell that building, get rid of that roof repair. But we should really do that in discernment, not, in this kind of ideology of like, we swing for fences. We either hit home runs or we strike out. And I think that's a kind of Silicon Valley reality that's really based in how venture capital works. You know what I mean? Like you raise money and they're gambling that they're going to turn that money into more money. But if you strike out on it, it is a certain kind of gamble. And I just don't know, other than the story in Acts where finding the disciple, you roll dice on that. It doesn't seem like that is, I guess we have one example of rolling dice being good discernment, but maybe it wasn't good discernment, because you can see in the book, we think that there was actually, that's a kind of formal logic, and the real apostle that's supposed to replace Judas is Paul, and that the Spirit does something different than the church meeting.
Well, you did make a really good segue there, going into church administration, what it looked like after the ascension of Jesus, when he says to his disciples, I want you to stay in Jerusalem and I want you to wait. Stay here, pray, worship, and wait for the Holy Spirit to come upon you. And, in your book, you said, Peter's like, hey, we're waiting, but we got to do something. So let's replace Judas. Let's get a 12th disciple. Why do you think that they were, even at the very beginning, impatient and not able to start to wait? And why is it that our human attempts to do something for God, why isn't that enough for our churches?
Yeah. So, our big point in the book is that we all want to say, and we all should say in many ways, that, Pentecost starts the church. So we're looking at Acts 2, and, especially in this day and age for the last 20 years, as we thought about the revitalization of Protestantism, we thought we got to be Acts 2 churches and things like that. And there's something really, I think, true about that we should embrace. But we do forget that in Acts 1, the first command that Jesus gives to the church is to go to Jerusalem and not do anything, but just to wait and wait for the Spirit to come. And yeah, we do play with it. I mean, I guess it's an exegetical, contested point, but our kind of playing with it is, that they get antsy. And so what do you do when you're antsy at a church and you feel like you're trying to do something against not knowing what to do? Is you start calling meetings and getting people on committees, but to directly address your question, I mean, I think there's something inherent in what it means to be a human being that we're always kind of evaluating our lives in the sense that we're always trying to aim our lives towards something good that it compels us to want to do something. And we do know ourselves and find ourselves deep in communities as we do things, as we actually take on actions. But there is a deep sense here that what's at stake in that is if you're aimed towards the wrong action, if you end up having a kind of misconstrued understanding of what is good, you can get things really messed up. And Jesus' command here to wait is really not to create it absolutely is not to create a community that doesn't do anything in the world or doesn't make a difference in the world or is so internally kind of constituted that it just wants to sit around and think about itself or something. That's the last thing Jesus wants. I think Jesus wants to create a community that is dependent on the Spirit and the Spirit's leading. And that does take a spiritual discipline. I mean, it's a discipline of learning how to wait. And what we're waiting for really is not to like our bank accounts to accrue or even for our energy to go up and be able to do something. What we're waiting for is the leading of the Spirit to lead us. So, Pentecost happens after the casting of the lots for the 12th disciple. And at least some theologians have interpreted this, that, we don't hear anything again after the selection is made, but we hear a lot in the rest of Acts about Paul, so the Spirit selects Paul, whether you want to call Paul the 12th apostle or not, but Paul thinks that about himself. Like he thinks his gospel is not mediated from anyone, just like Peter and James and John, it comes directly from Jesus. I mean, he's very clear about that in Galatians. Like you don't have to be circumcised because my gospel too came directly from Jesus. So he has this deep sense that he is an apostle in the same kind of immediacy that any of the 12 or 11 had encountered and walked with Jesus. And I do think that to hear the Spirit, we have to take on this ability to wait, and especially in a late modern time where it just feels like, I guess it's back to our building thing again, like do something. Yeah. Even if it's the wrong thing, do something. I don't know. I mean, that's a good, probably capitalist principle. I'm not sure it's a Christian principle, that like even if it's the wrong thing, just do it. I don't know. I think in the wisdom of Christianity, there's a sense of like, wait and be with your neighbor, hear their stories, allow spaces to break bread together and share in each other's lives. And particularly, there's a kind of dynamic of what does it mean to share in the sorrow of the world and to share in the sorrow of the neighbor. And in the midst of that, God's going to call you to something profound. Yeah. But there is a kind of passiveness to that. And I know that's even a really bad word for us late modern, middle class, upwardly mobile people. Like to be passive is like the worst thing you could be. But at the core even of the Reformation, Luther really thinks that the call of justification or the implications of justification is that we are rendered passive to have God's act, and that there's freedom in that passivity, that there's the learning to receive a gift. And so I think that's the ultimate thing. And maybe it is that us late modern people, especially Americans who lived in consumer capitalist societies, we don't really believe in gifts. We don't really receive in waiting to receive a gift. We think you earn what you get, and in hard work is what achieves it. And so how dare we wait? And yet I think if we don't wait, we just end up having this deep temptation of turning God into a product, into a pet, into our mascot, that we forget that God is not God. And we think that maybe we even think the church is more important than God, which I think is something to be aware of.
Yeah, we need to be aware of that. And I'm thinking that, a lot of, I think pastors subconsciously, they probably feel like, hey, I get paid, I have to do something. right?
Absolutely.
And if I'm going to be sitting in this place of waiting and teaching my congregation to wait, and let's wait on the acts of God and see how do we encounter God in the midst of it. Oh, we haven't heard from God, so we're not going to actually do anything right now. We're just going to sit and wait, and we're going to rehearse the story of the faithfulness of God throughout the centuries, and we're going to just wait. They're like, then there. I think the fear is, hey, I'm getting paid for this, and they're knowing that I'm not really doing anything for the money. I'm supposed to earn this money.
Yes.
That's gotta come into play somehow.
Absolutely. The kind of exchange economy comes in. Like there is a sense, I mean, this is where we've probably got this all theologically up in knots, but there's a certain sense, whether you feel it as a pastor or people actually say it to you in your church, they're paying for a service.
Yeah.
And I mean that kind of probably in the double meaning, like they're paying for you to oversee the service every Sunday, but they're paying for pastoral services. That's what they're paying for. They think that's what they're paying for, which is, gets it all wrong to be in the first place, to assume that the money you give in an offering plate means that, you're a consumer who's buying something. But also from the side of just being a pastor or a leader, you feel that, and I think you feel that even more so when it feels like resources are really thin, that the institution is really vulnerable. It becomes a really difficult thing. But it also does kind of show us that this more kind of mystical quality of Christian leadership has kind of disappeared, and what I mean by that is this kind of sense that your job is to pray for this community and teach this community to pray. And we don't get that from the kind of whatever judicatory structures we're in. We don't get that from above, so there's that level of feeling like, very few of us kind of work under people or have people kind of supervising us or that we're somehow accountable to, who are like, Gregory the Great, who's telling his bishops that they better not be too busy because they have to contemplate the Trinity. That if they end up too busy, then they don't have the time in their day to sit and contemplate the very beauty of God.
Wow.
I don't know too many bishops or, superintendents or whatever, saying to their pastors in their region, like, you better have enough time to sit and contemplate and pray. So you can see how difficult that is. But then you add on top of it, a lot of us feel like what even justifies our own existence is then there's a certain kind of competitive level. Like I spend a lot of time at conferences with pastors, and it's amazing how many, like, the first conversation is, I don't think it's a direct kind of flexing all the time, but there's a certain kind of low key flexing, like, how big's your church and what are you doing? And, like, it just doesn't seem like there would be much social capital and just being like, well, we're waiting right now. We've been waiting for 2 years, but yet the biblical text has this deep sense of people who faithfully waited for decades, like waiting and waiting and waiting, like the core of Old Testament texts as well as the New Testament texts have people who wait, and there's a deep faithfulness in that. But it's hard to feel like your own pastoral identity is being edified or even, like you're saying, justified in waiting.
Yeah. And so for the pastor, for the congregation, for all of us in this secular age, this Western culture that is going faster and faster and faster, where I think we're caught in this loop of never-ending cycle of trying to innovate and grow and make new things and smooth things out and not wait. How can we break free of that to move into a new and different space, or a space where the kingdom calls us to be and not the space that the secular age calls us to be?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and this is where I would just, I'll own my own theological perspective and vision here, and that it rests maybe on a tradition that other people don't hold, or maybe would lead them to nuance this in certain ways. But I do think there's a deep sense that in moments of persons sharing in suffering or loss, in a very non-instrumental way, and it's just a call to be with each other, that there becomes this kind of profound encounter with the presence of God. And so, this takes us beyond this book, but I've been thinking a lot lately of the importance of kind of consolation in pastoral practice. And you see this from Gregory of Nyssa all the way through to kind of Martin Luther, that these giving consolation to people who are in the midst of moments of deep sorrow becomes a real place where it almost becomes deeply sacramental, that the presence of God is there in the kind of sharing of this sorrow, that God seems to work through the community to bring life out of those experiences of death. And so I think we do have to have certain different visions that this God primarily moves in places of brokenness and loss, and that we need to be quite attentive to that. And part of the problem with not being able to wait is any of those people who find themselves in these moments of great sorrow or needing consolation, they just get, and it's not done purposefully, but you just get kind of obliterated and pushed out. The wake of just the need to do more just kind of washes over those people and drowns them out. Instead of kind of having a very reverse kind of perspective, that those are the most attentive places we need to be, that we need to really tend to those kind of stories and those articulations. And I guess really formally, and we end the book this way, is the kind of waiting we're calling for is not the kind of like waiting at an airport, like when your flight's delayed, like that's the worst kind of waiting, like we've been pretty much told by consumer markets and by consumer capitalism that any kind of waiting is an enemy because it keeps you from getting what you want. And at the very least, even if you're kind of aimless, you should be able to move and you should be able to do stuff, like that's at least a distraction you can live with or something. But and we get it. Like there's kind of waiting that is dehumanizing and is not very productive. And I guess this goes back to the kind of church and spaces too. Like waiting in certain spaces are meant to be, I think Charles Taylor calls this like no place places, like gates at airports. Like it's not really a place, it's and you feel just caught in between in those kind of, or a doctor's waiting room is kind of a no place, where you're like, my gosh, this is not enjoyable to wait in this space. And so, even thinking about our churches as not being no place places, but real places to be in, which more, the medieval imagination really had that sense. Like there's those stained glass windows and here's this Gothic architecture that's to remind you that you are in a particular place, a place that echoes heaven. That becomes very different to pray inside of those spaces and be within them. But we also think that narratives can have that kind of Gothic kind of artistic beckoning as well. And so what we really think you need to wait with is with a watchword, with a kind of story that encompasses the community, that really calls calls a community to wait on watch, and it is amazing when you're at an airport, no one's waiting on watch. No. Everyone is watching their phones or their iPads to kind of keep themselves from realizing that they're waiting. They're distracting themselves. And I think we often think of waiting as distraction. And I think what we really want in the kind of Christian formation we're talking about is a kind of attentive waiting that's watching for something, that's really trying to be near the stories of sorrow and trying to call us in to hold those stories and to hear those stories and to even proclaim that those stories have some kind of sacramental weight, even if it's a kind of lowercase s sacramental, but it does really point to sharing in those is a movement of God bringing life out of death.
Yeah. And we're sharing the stories, the narrative that we've come through. And that this watchword is really important. And it's important for you here is to get rid of our mission statements and get a watchword, right? And, our mission statements is like, hey, let's go. I lead a mission organization. We got our mission statements. We're moving. We're going as fast as we can. And it's producing a lot of anxiety. And like, I have to produce, but I'm not the one producing, like I'm either watering, I'm sowing, but God's producing the fruit. I'm faithful in what he's called me to do, but we don't have a metric like that. And even for donors or people, I have to say, here's the fruit of our ministry and our work, or else we're not going to be funded to be able to move forward. It's really tough. So how do we even move somewhere where we actually have, and so even an active space and a place where you say, hey, there's a lot of outward activity within our community, and say our watchword is something like, I was meeting with somebody this morning who's helping an Algerian church, a lot of people from a Muslim background, and they have an Algerian community that they're trying to reach out to. And I talked to him about this watchword, and I was talking to him, and he thinks the thing that's repeated the most in our story is that we're a lighthouse for our community. And so as a lighthouse, they're saying that, hey, we are a beacon of light and hope that God is for this community, but it's also a place where there's going to be some activity and some interaction within the local community. How can we get to this place of a watchword and faithfulness when there is something to say, if we want to sustain ourselves and get some funds, we need to produce some fruit?
Yeah. Yeah, it's such an important question. And, it would be utterly hypocritical for me at a denominational seminary that is, run by donor dollars and by an incredibly excellent development office to be like, who cares about that? That would be the utter state of privilege. But it is interesting. I mean, it is interesting. Like it's meant to be a little bit capture your imagination, to be like, get rid of your mission statement and find a watchword. We only say that in the sense that like it feels like every church has a mission statement, like every congregation has one, and we are told kind of across any institutional structure that every institution needs some kind of mission statement. Like the local parks organization needs a mission statement. I mean, my gosh, from Parks and Rec, Leslie Knope was always working on a mission statement. I mean, we need that. And there's something that, of course, that's really important about it. The mission statement holds us accountable. It gets everybody kind of on the same page. So in a real way, we're not actually saying like, don't have a mission statement anymore. You need that. But there also is this temptation that when you just have a mission statement, or your mission statement is like what makes our church different, or what's our church's reason for being, that there's the temptation that the church's story becomes the most important story. Yeah. That your congregation story becomes the most important story. And like as a consulting people before, I've said this, and most consultants will, like your church, you got to find why you exist. What's the reason you exist? And we should say that, but theologically, we have to remember that the church is never the star of its own story. That the star of this story is God, and that even the best supporting actor, like if there are Oscar nominations, the church doesn't even get to be a supporting actor in this biblically. Like the world is what God is ministering to, and the church gets to narrate this story, and that is really important. And the church has a significant piece to play in salvation history here, but the church is to be a servant of this larger story. And so we should have mission statements, but they do have to have this kind of sense of serving this larger vision. And I think, we think a watchword is really helpful. And I don't know, this is something that we're going to have to test out as we go here. And it almost sounds weird to say this, but I do think that there is ways to hold our communities accountable, and to say a donor that this is worth supporting. But even there has to be spiritual activity done there too. I mean, there's in some sense, I think any, good development person will tell you that this is a ministry, that this is a real ministry to talk to people about how to spend their money. That it is a fundamentally spiritual reality. And so to say to people like, we have a particular story in a way that we're seeing the world and engaging the world, and this is what it looks like. I think the move is, how do we then narrate those metrics, if you even want to call them metrics? But like, how do we think of the way we even hold ourselves accountable to donors or others being testimonies of God's presence and God's action in the world, and not just we've had 19% growth, where, you know what I mean? Like, it's really easy to just make those numbers. I wonder about how, I mean, through Paul's epistles, there's a lot of, why don't you give some money to the church of Jerusalem?
Yeah.
Like, you are called to give money to the church of Jerusalem. But it tends not to, there's not language of optimization here. And, it tends to be embedded in what it means to be in Christ and what it means for the cross to lead us. And we have to do a lot more thinking about this, I think, at this late stage capitalism, about what it really means to talk to people, even about money. I don't know. I've thought a lot about how money and, I don't know, this is maybe controversial, but like how money and sex kind of exist in the same kind of realm where they're really they're your own business, and you really should talk about them in a certain way. And they definitely have a sense that there's not a spiritual dynamic to them per se. And I wonder about that. I wonder how we get to this late stage capitalism where we don't perceive money as having a deep, deep spiritual dynamic to it, you know?
Yeah.
In a call to obedience to it. And even, I feel uncomfortable with that myself, like how we work that out. But we're going to need a watchword for that too, to think about what our money really means. I don't know. It's very complicated, but important stuff.
Yeah. Well, if you're following Jesus, I mean, you're going to have to just hear his words on economics and on money. And it's a radical obedience to not serve money at all. And that it's all God's money. And so how does that fit and work? And it's not easy.
Yeah. And inside an age of authenticity, I guess that's what, I mean, like, how do we even live with a sense like your money's not your own, and maybe your body and the depth of your sexual expression is not your own. Like, these things are given over to God in a certain way. And the call of discipleship demands that. Those feel really risky things. And yet Jesus does not shy away from
not at all.
From naming. Yeah.
Not at all. So, he doesn't shy away at all. And also, as you've been talking, we're thinking about, if we're going to be people who wait on the acts of God and saying God's going to act and we want to encounter him in these spaces, it feels like we should, I don't want to innovate my way into a new thing because we're talking about innovation's not the answer. But how does architecture, the thing that got me really excited when studying church history, coming from really Baptist and non-denominational spaces of church, where it feels like I'm almost in an empty room, like the architecture of churches, like pointing to God, telling stories in stained glass. It felt like this is a place I could encounter God, and I could wait, and I could be in this space. In other church buildings, it feels like, hey, this is just a way station where I'm now on my way through my life, and this is a place to stop, just like a gate in the airport. How do we reorient just all of the community and spaces and places where we could start to point people towards, this is the work of the body to do this?
Yeah. I mean, it's such a good question. There's part of me too, I think, that feels like, my gosh, I don't know. I mean, maybe this is nostalgic, but I think that there is a temptation for certain theologians, and maybe I'm starting to move that direction, where it's like there's nostalgia for the pre-modern world, and like, what would it be like to enter back into church spaces where there are frescoes and, the smells and the bells were there, and, like just walking up to the Chartres Cathedral and seeing all this, incredible Gothic beauty. I'm not sure that we're ever getting back there. You know what I mean? Like I maybe there's a huge cultural changes that are going to happen in the next 150 years where we'll return to these spaces. But when you read up how we got to this, like the cathedral building that starts to happen, in the 12th, 13th, and 14th century. I mean, that takes its own. I mean, there's a whole history of multiple dynamics that allow that to occur. And one of the reasons it goes away for Protestants is this deep assertion that there is still an intricate space where we encounter the presence of God. It's just that the intricate space isn't outside of us, it's within us. It's in our hearts. And that's a very intricate space. So this space that we actually sit with our bodies in should be blank so that we can turn internal to this very artistically nuanced internal space. The problem has been, and I think, is that internal turn has been secularized in multiple ways. That it has led to a kind of not an internal move that takes us out of ourselves, but an internal move that just becomes about me and it becomes about the self I'm constructing. And I do think the way back from that, probably, I guess this is why I land on narratives and stories so much, is that I think that they become kind of intricate, that intricate kind of Gothic-like internal comes external in a certain way, and that the stories become these intricate spaces. And I do think we have been trained as late modern people to hear stories as profoundly transformational and important to us. Like even going into like a Gothic church now, going into even like Notre Dame or Sean Chappelle or something like that. I love the stained glass, but I've not been trained. Like I wasn't raised in a context to really understand it. Like I don't get the story, but there's a story there that even a medieval peasant would have walked into and seen. Like there's the biblical story. There's a story going on there. But the way my cultural imagination has shaped me, I don't really get it. I get how beautiful it is, but I don't really, get the story. And I think in a kind of similar way, the way we've been kind of formed is to be very open to these stories that we get from everywhere, whether it's from Ted Lasso or from novels we read or whatever. And so maybe there's this need even more so to find that intricate space through the narratives and the stories that we share. So maybe in kind of low church traditions, like the ones, that you're aware of, the place of testimony is often tried to be that intricate space. And maybe we need to get back there in a theologically rich way that still talks about kind of symbol and ritual and things like that, but is really about how kind of testimony functions. What's I think happened poorly in a kind of American context of even testimony is it's become instrumentalized too. Like you hear that story and then it does X, Y, and Z instead of it just being beautiful, and that is one thing we can learn from the 12th, 13th century, particularly, is that beauty in itself is enough. I mean, we just, as we're recording this, we just celebrated Easter, and one of the reasons, at least in the traditions I'm in, you flower the cross on Easter morning is obviously a symbolism of Jesus' resurrection, but it also is a huge articulation, a proclamation that beauty comes out of this darkness, that this is beautiful and that the resurrection is fundamentally beautiful. And so we do have to embrace beauty again, but maybe we do it through narratives that we hear.
Yeah, it comes to, as narratives and story, it comes to, and in Revelation, they defeated the enemy with the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. But in Revelation, we're called to be witnesses to Jesus, to this Lamb, and we are the witnesses. And I think maybe part of our story, I'm just thinking part of our story is, what does it mean to be a witness? We've changed that word a little bit to be a proclaimer of something. But what does it mean to be a witness when we're trying to wait and see where God is at work in the lives of people?
Yeah, and I think that absolutely that kind of witness is also the articulation that God has shown up, and that's why we're willing to wait. That we have people in this community who God has met them in moments of real loss and death, that God is near in these experiences, so it is the proclamation that God moves, and then therefore God has moved, and therefore God will move again. And so I think the witness really is the witness to the places in our lives where God has encountered us in places of death, bringing life out of it, and to me, that's the most direct as well as beautiful proclamation that really has to be witnessed to in our lives. that we need to make, of these places where God has brought life out of death. But if you can't, for whatever reason, bear the darkness, you can't see the beauty of that light breaking into it, So if you can't bear the darkness because you just don't have time for that, like let's go. Like we don't have time to hear this story, to walk with this person, or because you have some kind of triumphalist view of the Christian message or something, then you do miss something. Yeah. And you miss the necessary kind of dialectic of cross to resurrection that plays in here. That's really important, I think. And in the way ascension plays in, cross, resurrection, ascension, and from the ascension you get the calling. You get the Spirit who comes and calls us out. But that starts with waiting as a community. I mean, it is interesting that in Acts 1, Jesus doesn't go like, go to your own places and wait by yourself. But no, they're still supposed to gather and be together. But they're supposed to wait together for God to move.
Yeah, I love this. This is a great, when church stops working, it's a great distillation of a lot of work of your secular age series. And I think it's going to be helpful for church leaders and elder boards and others to be able to read this and know, okay, there's some things that we can do, and we could be people that wait for God, and that we can call people to this encounter with God, and we can call people into places of encountering one another. And we don't have to speed up and innovate and grow as much. That there's different metrics that we could have where we're actually getting back to what it means to be followers of the way and walking together in community. And so I think it's going to be really helpful for a lot of people. If you really want to know what the crisis is, and the crisis is not, you should go read this book, When Church Stops Working, to figure out what we need to do to be people that wait for God, to be people that encounter God, encounter one another, be people that are not caught up in this secular age that produces so much anxiety and depression and fear that we're not smoothing things out enough. That we actually have to be comfortable with the crisis, that there is going to be crisis in our life, and we need to sit with those who are grieving, sit with those that are disappointed in life, and we could bring life and beauty out of death and destruction. This is the story that we have been called into. This is the Christian story. So go get When Church Stops Working. It's a fantastic read and it's helpful. And go back and just get all of Andrew Root's secular age series. There's like 5 books and they're all fantastic and well worth the read. So Andy, thank you so much for this conversation, and thank you that you actually showed us a new way and a way to live the story and rehearse the story that we have been involved in for 2,000 years, and that we actually don't need this new innovation and growth and productivity, but we need to be caught up in the story of God. It's not our story. We're caught up in God's story. So thank you so much, Andy. It was a pleasure to talk to you. I really enjoyed it. So thank you so much. Thank you for listening to the show today. If you're really enjoying the show, please don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app. You could do it right now. Just hit that little plus. And then I would love it if you would leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. So you could go right now to the show and leave a star rating and review and let us know how you are enjoying the show. And find us on Facebook and Instagram. So if you want to connect, interact, I post a lot of quotes and different things that you could actually interact with the episodes and let me know how you are enjoying the show. If you feel inclined to donate, there is a support the show link in the show notes, and it would send you directly to a page where you could donate so that new episodes can be produced for your enjoyment. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope You have an incredible week.